In the collective memory of the world, the Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. We see it as a sudden, terrible rupture, a moment when the fragile peace of the interwar years was shattered by Nazi aggression. But this is a comforting illusion. The war did not begin in 1939. It began years earlier, not with a single, deafening explosion, but with a series of seemingly small, distant tremors that the world chose to ignore. For an entire decade, from 1931 to 1941, a sequence of aggressive acts, broken treaties, and unanswered atrocities laid the foundation for the greatest cataclysm in human history. This was the decade of denial. It was a time when the great powers of the world, haunted by the memory of the last war and crippled by economic depression, stood by and watched as aggressor nations tested the limits of international law, found them wanting, and grew ever bolder. Each time a line was crossed and the world did nothing, another domino was set up, ready to fall. This is the hidden story of the 10-year march to hell. It's the tale of the warning signs that were missed, the moral failures that were rationalized, and the slow, inexorable slide into a global conflict that could have, and should have, been stopped. Our story begins not in Europe, but in the far eastern province of Manchuria, China, in September of 1931. The Empire of Japan, a rising power with a powerful military and a desperate need for resources, had long coveted this vast, resource-rich region. All they needed was a pretext. On the night of September 18th, a small explosion occurred on a section of the Japanese-owned South Manchuria Railway. The damage was minimal. In fact, a train passed over the spot just minutes later without issue. But the Japanese army claimed it was an act of Chinese sabotage. It was a lie. The bomb had been planted by their own officers. Using this manufactured incident as an excuse, the Japanese Guangdong Army launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. The Chinese forces were overwhelmed. The Japanese army, disciplined and technologically superior, swept across the province. The world watched in shock. China appealed to the League of Nations, the international body that had been created after World War I specifically to prevent this kind of aggression. The League responded with a forcefulness that would set the tone for the entire decade. They formed a commission, sent investigators, and, after a year of deliberation, published a report that concluded Japan was the aggressor. And then they did nothing. No sanctions were imposed. No military action was threatened. The message sent to the aggressors of the world was loud and clear. You can invade a sovereign nation, and the international community will respond with a strongly worded letter. Japan, in a gesture of contempt, simply walked out of the League of Nations and solidified its control over its new puppet state, which it called Manchukuo. The first domino had fallen. Watching from Europe were two other ambitious leaders who were taking careful notes: Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany. They saw Japan's success as a blueprint. They saw that the so-called world order was a hollow shell, and that bold, aggressive action would likely go unpunished. The next domino was set up in Africa. Mussolini, dreaming of recreating the Roman Empire, had his sights set on Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia, one of the few independent nations left on the continent. In 1935, using a minor border dispute as a pretext, he launched a full-scale invasion. The war was a brutal showcase of modern industrial power against a feudal army. The Italian army used tanks, bombers, and, most horrifyingly, poison gas, which had been outlawed by international treaty. They indiscriminately bombed civilian centers and sprayed mustard gas from the air onto Ethiopian soldiers and villages alike. The Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, went before the League of Nations in Geneva and delivered one of the most powerful and prophetic speeches of the 20th century. "It is us today," he warned. "It will be you tomorrow." The world listened, expressed its sympathy, and once again, did almost nothing. The League imposed a few weak economic sanctions on Italy but deliberately excluded oil, the one resource that could have crippled Mussolini's war machine. Britain and France, desperate to keep Italy as a potential ally against the rising threat of Nazi Germany, were unwilling to take any action that might truly anger Mussolini. And so, Ethiopia was conquered. The second domino had fallen. The lesson was reinforced. Aggression works. Now all eyes turned to Germany. Adolf Hitler had been patiently watching and learning. He had seen the weakness and division of the Western democracies. He saw their fear of another war, their obsession with their own economic problems, and their unwillingness to act. And he decided it was time to push his own domino. In March of 1936, in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, he ordered his troops to march into the Rhineland, the demilitarized industrial heartland of Germany bordering France. This was an enormous gamble. The German army was still weak, and Hitler's own generals were terrified. They believed the French army, then the most powerful in Europe, would immediately respond with force, and the German troops would have to retreat in humiliation. Hitler himself later admitted, "The 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking in my life. If the French had then marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. But the French did not march. Haunted by the memory of the 1.5 million men they had lost in the last war, and paralyzed by political division, the French government would not act without British support." And the British government, in a sentiment famously expressed by one lord, said it was merely the Germans walking into their own back garden. They saw it as a reasonable action by a sovereign nation. They did nothing. For Hitler, this was a moment of profound triumph. He had faced down the great powers of Europe and had won without firing a shot. His prestige within Germany soared. He became convinced of his own infallibility, and his generals, who had advised caution, were now seen as weak and timid. The third domino had fallen, and it was perhaps the most important one yet. It proved to Hitler that he could break treaties, use military force, and the West would respond with nothing but diplomatic protests. The next year, 1937, saw the board expand once more. In Spain, a brutal civil war erupted between the democratically elected Republican government and a nationalist faction led by General Francisco Franco. Hitler and Mussolini immediately saw an opportunity. They sent troops, tanks, and, most importantly, aircraft to support Franco. The Spanish Civil War became a dress rehearsal for World War II. The German Condor Legion, a unit of the Luftwaffe, used Spain as a testing ground for its new planes and tactics. They perfected the art of dive bombing and close air support. And in one of the most infamous acts of the decade, they bombed the undefended Basque town of Guernica, an attack immortalized in Picasso's masterpiece. The bombing of Guernica was a deliberate act of terror, designed to show the world the horrifying power of modern air power. It was a warning, a terrifying preview of what would be unleashed on Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, and countless other cities just a few years later. Once again, the world watched in horror, and once again, did nothing of consequence. While Spain burned, the fire in Asia reignited with even greater ferocity. In July 1937, Japan, using another manufactured incident near the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing, launched a full-scale invasion of the rest of China. This was no longer a limited regional conflict. It was total war. The Japanese army swept through China with a brutality that shocked the world. The culmination of this was the infamous rape of Nanking in late 1937, where Japanese soldiers engaged in a 6-week orgy of murder, torture, and mass assault, killing an estimated 300,000 Chinese civilians and unarmed soldiers. The evidence was undeniable. Western journalists and diplomats who were in the city documented the atrocities. But the reaction from the Western powers was muted. They were preoccupied with Hitler. The events in the far-off, chaotic land of China seemed distant and less important. Another domino had fallen, and the world was looking the other way. By 1938, Hitler was ready to make his next move. His target was his homeland, Austria. The Treaty of Versailles expressly forbade a union or Anschluss between Germany and Austria. But Hitler, now supremely confident, began to put immense political pressure on the Austrian government, using the Austrian Nazi Party to create chaos and demand unification. In March 1938, he sent his troops across the border. There was no invasion. It was a triumphant procession. The Austrian people, for the most part, welcomed the German soldiers as liberators. Hitler himself entered Vienna to a hero's welcome. And the reaction from the Allies? Britain and France lodged a formal protest and then accepted the new reality. The idea of self-determination was used as a justification. If the Austrian people wanted to be part of Germany, who were they to stop them? Another domino, another treaty broken, another act of aggression met with inaction. Now Hitler's gaze turned to his next target, Czechoslovakia. This was different. Czechoslovakia was a modern, prosperous democracy with a strong army and a powerful system of fortifications on its border with Germany. It also had a defense treaty with France. An attack on Czechoslovakia should have meant war. Hitler's pretext was the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. He began to claim that the Germans in the Sudetenland were being oppressed and that the region must be returned to Germany. He whipped up a frenzy of propaganda and threatened to invade. Europe was on the brink of war in the summer of 1938. But the leaders of Britain and France, particularly the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, were desperate to avoid it. Chamberlain was an honorable man who genuinely believed that another great war would be the end of civilization. He also believed faithfully that he could reason with Hitler. He flew to Germany 3 times to meet with the Führer, each time coming back believing he had averted war. This culminated in the infamous Munich Conference in September 1938. There, the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy met with Hitler and agreed to all of his demands. They would force Czechoslovakia to hand over the Sudetenland to Germany. The Czechoslovaks themselves were not even invited to the meeting. They were told that if they resisted, they would have to fight Germany alone. Betrayed by their allies, they had no choice but to submit. Chamberlain returned to London, famously waving a piece of paper and declaring that he had achieved peace for our time. It was perhaps the most tragically wrong statement in modern history. The Munich Agreement was the high watermark of appeasement. It was a complete moral and strategic capitulation. The Allies had sacrificed a democratic nation in the vain hope of satisfying a dictator whose ambitions were limitless. Winston Churchill, then a lone voice in the political wilderness, saw the truth with chilling clarity. In a speech to Parliament, he declared, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." He was right. Hitler was not satisfied. He had been denied the short, victorious war he had wanted to crush Czechoslovakia, and he was now more convinced than ever that the Western leaders were weak, cowardly men who would never fight. 6 months later, in March 1939, he broke the promises he had made at Munich and sent his troops to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was the final, undeniable proof. Hitler was not interested in uniting German-speaking peoples. He was interested in conquest. For Chamberlain and the other appeasers, it was a moment of profound humiliation. The policy of appeasement was dead. The lie had been exposed. The world finally realized that war was inevitable. The last domino was about to fall. The only question now was where. The answer came on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler, using another faked incident as a pretext, unleashed his blitzkrieg on Poland. This time, Britain and France honored their treaty obligations and declared war on Germany. The Second World War had officially begun. But the narrative that the war began in 1939 is an illusion. The war had been raging in pieces for nearly a decade. It had been fought in the fields of Manchuria, the mountains of Ethiopia, the streets of Spain, and the cities of China. The events of September 1939 were not a beginning. They were a culmination. They were the predictable, inevitable result of a decade of denial, of a series of moments when the world had the chance to stop the march to hell and chose to look away. Each act of aggression, from Manchuria in 1931 to Poland in 1939, was a test. Each time the world failed the test, the aggressors grew bolder, their ambitions grew larger, and the price of eventually stopping them grew higher. Why did the world let this happen? The reasons are complex. A toxic cocktail of trauma, fear, and miscalculation. The memory of the First World War was a deep, open wound. The war to end all wars had killed a generation and bankrupted empires. The leaders and people of Britain and France were willing to do almost anything to avoid a repeat of that horror. This pacifism was not cowardice. It was born from a profound and understandable trauma, but it blinded them to the new reality that a different kind of leader had emerged in the world. one who did not share their desire for peace. The Great Depression also played a crucial role. The nations of the West were crippled by economic collapse. They were focused inward on unemployment and social unrest. They simply did not have the financial resources or the political will to rearm and confront distant threats. Rearmament was unpopular. It meant raising taxes and cutting social programs. It was easier to hope for the best than to prepare for the worst. And finally, there was a catastrophic failure to understand the nature of the enemy. Leaders like Chamberlain were men of a different era. They were products of a 19th-century world of rational diplomacy. They believed that all leaders, at their core, were reasonable men who could be negotiated with. They projected their own values onto Hitler and Mussolini. They could not comprehend that they were dealing with fanatical ideologues who were driven by a vision of racial supremacy and military conquest, men who saw compromise as weakness and treaties as temporary conveniences. They thought they were playing a game of chess with a rational opponent. They didn't realize they were sitting across the table from a man who was happy to kick over the board and set the world on fire. This decade of denial, this series of missed opportunities and failed tests, had a profound and tragic consequence. It allowed the Axis powers to grow from regional bullies into a global menace. It allowed them to rearm, to test their weapons and tactics, and to seize strategic resources, all while their future enemies watched. By the time the war finally came to Europe in 1939, Germany was no longer the weak nation of 1936. It was a formidable military power, confident in its abilities and convinced of the weakness of its opponents. The price of appeasement was paid in the blood of millions. The battles of 1940 and 1941, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, the invasion of the Soviet Union, all were made possible by the failures of the 1930s. The world had to fight a much longer, much bloodier, and much more destructive war because it had been unwilling to fight a smaller one earlier. The story of the march to World War II is a chilling lesson in the dangers of wishful thinking. It's a reminder that peace is not preserved by hoping for it, but by being willing to defend it. It shows that evil, when left unchecked, does not moderate itself. It grows. The tremors that began in Manchuria in 1931 grew into an earthquake that would shake the foundations of the entire world. And it all happened while the leaders of the free world stood by, hoping, praying, and doing nothing, until it was far too late. The world had been warned, again and again, and had failed to listen. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place on December 7, 1941. With the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan brought the United States fully into the conflict. The series of regional wars had finally, undeniably, merged into a single global cataclysm. There were no more separate fronts in Europe and Asia. There was only the world at war. The year 1942 would be the first full year of this truly global conflict, a year of brutal fighting on every continent and every ocean. It was the year the world finally woke up from its decade of denial and faced the horrifying reality of what it had allowed to grow in the shadows. The full, terrible cost of the failures of the 1930s would now be paid, from the frozen steppes of Stalingrad to the jungles of Guadalcanal, from the deserts of North Africa to the depths of the Atlantic. The story of 1931 to 1941 is not just a prelude to the Second World War. It is an essential part of it. It is the story of how the seeds of conflict were sown, watered by indifference, and allowed to grow into a monstrous forest that would eventually consume the world. It is a cautionary tale that echoes through history. It teaches us that small acts of aggression, when ignored, become large ones. It teaches us that choosing dishonor to avoid war only guarantees that you will have both. And it teaches us that the march to hell is often a slow, gradual descent, made up of 1,000 small steps that no one thought were significant, until they reached the edge of the abyss. The world had 10 years of warning, and it ignored every single one.